Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
So our second speaker today is Professor Richard Rosengarten. Professor Rosengarten is Associate Professor of Religion and Literature and Director of MA Studies here at the Divinity School. Professor Rosengarten's work, too, negotiates multiple intersections within the study of religion and its intersections with English and American literature. He's an expert on the long 18th century, but has worked as well in contemporary theory, the American novel, French thought, and art history. He's the author of Henry Fielding and the Narration of Providence, Divine Design and the Incursions of Evil, published with Palgrave in 2000, and is completing a book on Roman Catholicism between the Vatican Councils entitled Styles of Catholicism, Flannery O'Connor, Frida Kahlo, and Simone Weil. Additionally, he served here as the Dean of the Divinity School from 2000 to 2010, has been editor of the Journal of Religion, or I think still is, and has served in multiple leadership roles across the university and indeed across the discipline of religious studies. His paper today is entitled Ricoeur's Cycle of Myths and America's E Pluribus Unum, or Notes on the One and the Many. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rosengarten.
Thanks, Professor Hammerschlag, Professor Anderson, worthy guests, good to see you all here. Paul Ricoeur's The Symbolism of Evil announces and enacts its author's first full-fledged foray into hermeneutics. The text's opening gambit to, quote, surprise the idea of fault in its transition, end quote, spawns the formulation of a series of symbols from defilement to sin to guilt, and in turn of myths, Greek, Hebrew, Christian, Orphic, that afford the reader what is arguably the first Ricoeurian cultural architectonic. In what follows, my controlling interest is Symbolism of Evil's endgame, Ricoeur's formulation of the cycle of myths, and his claim that the quartet of human-divine relations that issue through myth from symbol into thought describe an incipient and crucial interaction that includes both the privileging of one and, in turn, the obligatory self-conscious inflection of this one by the remaining three. The mandate of that Ricoeurian cycle is that we must choose and we must also inflect. What emerges from Symbolism of Evil is the actual meaning of its coda. The symbol gives rise to thought. The thought is not the myths, but this mutual process of election and inflection. As readers of Ricoeur well know, the direction of his subsequent work describes a trajectory in which the discourses that construct and constitute culture, metaphor and narrative, issue in first an anguished phenomenology of memory and forgetting, and then consideration of ethics, justice, and the self in public life. My exegesis of the cycle of myths does not intend directly to follow this trajectory, but instead to work within this initial analytic to propose an American cycle of myths as geographies of the United States, of antebellum America. The four myths, quote unquote, are Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, Herman Melville's Moby Dick or The Whale, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin or Life Among the Lowly, and Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. My hypothesis is that these four books afford a parallel or micro or local case of what Ricoeur sketches at the macro or general level of cultural sensibility. Not incidental to the analogy and central to my brief readings of each, and you'll be happy to hear their brief, is the fact that each novel's mythic geography has its basis in an enduring cultural symbol. The Scarlet Letter, the White Whale, Uncle Tom, Little Women. If, as I want to argue, each of these symbols can be understood to give rise to a particular mythic geography, do we have, in this remarkable American cultural moment, a mandate to choose and then to inflect? Is there, to put the matter differently, any useful affinity between Ricoeur's endgame of a mythic cycle and the American polity's affirmation of E Pluribus Unum? Is Ricoeur's cycle a way to think usefully about the problem of the one and the many? Part 1, the cycle of myths and the symbolism of evil. Ricoeur's broad aim in symbolism is to develop a phenomenology of confession, what he describes as the human movement from the experience of fallibility to the attribution of fault. It is this transition that must be surprised and then reenacted. It becomes clear over the course of the text that the surprise is necessary because the connection between what humans term evil and its usual attributions, that is to say, the experience of suffering, the fact of death, the question of theodicy, is inadequate to evil's true signification for Ricoeur as, quote, supremely the experience of the sacred. Ricoeur understands this reenactment to be neither religious experience itself, nor yet, and the yet is important, philosophy, even as the ultimate goal is to bring the elucidation of confession into philosophical discourse. Emblematic for Ricoeur of the disjunction in evil's attribution is the need to guard against the imposition of the idea of original sin, which Ricoeur regards as a rationalization at the end, not the beginning of the phenomenon of confession. Ricoeur aims to reenact, then, nothing less than the experience of Adam that has been eclipsed both in Judaism, courtesy of Abraham and Noah, and in Christianity, ditto of Paul. By the experience of Adam, Ricoeur stipulates the initiating myth of Adam in the book of Genesis, but it will become clear that it is impossible fully to appreciate and understand this postulation absent reference to parallel traditions in ancient Greece. At this point, hermeneutics becomes the necessary handmaiden of phenomenology. The experience of the sacred is expressed in myth, and myth is symbolic. The relationship is understood to be symbiotic. A symbol is a kind of sign in the universe of discourse that has a double intentionality that resists reduction to either the allegorical or the logical. Symbols are the basis of myths in that symbols are spontaneously formed and have immediately significant analogical meaning. Myths are symbols in the form of narratives in time and space that are not coordinated with history and geography according to the critical method. The reenactment of necessity focuses on the language of confession that is the living experience of fault in language. In necessarily brief compass here, the symbolism of fault expresses a tripartite phenomenal character, blindness, equivocation, scandal, that finds tripartite symbolic expression, defilement, sin, guilt. Ricoeur describes through these symbols a graduating, even an encompassing signification, so that we might describe the symbolic expression of fault as moving from defilement, stain as unaccountable visitation causing dread, to sin, abandonment as a function of the dynamic of infinite divine demand and finite code of conduct, to guilt, self-imputation of fault as inevitable yet responsible failure. Here is Ricoeur's attempt to answer the need for surprise. This delineated movement is meant both to index and to afford the antidote to the slippage of fault into fallibility. Before turning to Ricoeur's account of myth, it is crucial to note that his discussion of symbol recurrently ranges well beyond the story of Adam, as noted above. The most continuous extensive references are to the Hebrew Bible, including Genesis, Exodus, and Deuteronomy, but most prominently Job, and also, quote, the rich palette of the knowledge of sin that Ricoeur adduces particularly in Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Hosea. The second major elusive set is Greek literature, with a primary emphasis on the tragedians, among whom Sophocles' Oedipus and, as noted, Antigone enjoy pride of place, and some allusions to Plato, in particular Gorgias. With the symbol of guilt, the dimension of symbol as inflected comes into full relief. The writings of Paul become prominent, and Ricoeur argues for a synthesis in which what he now terms the third form of fault has three aspects: penal rationalization from the Greek, ethical awareness from the Hebrew, and legal wretchedness from the Pauline. The key here is that guilt's aspects foreshadow symbolism of evil's culminating argument, that within a culture we must speak not of myth, but of myths, and that the work of culture is precisely the work not just of articulation, but of inflection. The awareness of defilement and sin that is the hallmark of guilt is the result of three mythic traditions in common engagement. Foreshadowed, but not made explicit at this point, is the status of particular myths in this process. This is what understandably most confuses readers of the symbolism of evil about Ricoeur's culminating rearticulation as, quote, the servile will. The cultural move from fallibility to fault is manifestly teleological in ways that, for all Ricoeur's averred discounting of the Pauline, appears proto-Christian. Ricoeur has shown us how symbols may be understood to inform and inflect each other, but he has not shown us what might be understood to inform the telos of inflection. At this point, he turns to myth as the symbolic articulation of the relation of the human to the sacred. With the symbol of guilt, we have, Ricoeur argues, a representation that moves beyond the purview of the symbol, precisely because the symbol alone cannot give a full phenomenological account of the human experience of evil. This account requires, and myth enables, a reconciliation of essence and existence in two respects. It offers a characterization of humankind as a whole and of history as ideal. It enables categories such as man, quote unquote, which we've had questioned interestingly, and existence, quote unquote. And it captures via narration the movement of experience, the dynamic witnessed in the movement from fallibility to fault in defilement, sin, and guilt. What myth is not proves important to Ricoeur's articulation. It is not allegory. It is not etiological, neither history nor explanation. Instead, it is rather an opening up, a disclosure, a second-degree function of the primary symbols we have been exploring. Ricoeur here takes exception to phenomenologists of myth, such as Mircea Eliade, Gerardus van der Loo, Lienhart, etc., who privilege a consciousness behind the narrative as the proper object of our investigation. Ricoeur himself proposes to do precisely the opposite, that is, to study myth as an expression in language, as the symbol taking the form of narration. This entails for Ricoeur a crucial claim about the limit of myth. Myth intuits a cosmic whole that is named but not given. It necessarily lends contingent form to the sacred, and in doing so acknowledges that it is less than fully congruent with the totality of reality. Finiteness of experience results in symbolic plenitude. No one mythic act encompasses symbolically the totality, so there are multiple mythic acts. In an important sense, myth is strategic. The plenitude qua plenitude would be everywhere, so we need to symbolize to say anything meaningful about it. There are two consequences of this limiting claim. One is that myth is narrative because it is primordial drama. The combat it represents, in which the sacred is invoked, contested, and re-invoked, is most amenable to the repetition and iteration of the narrative form. The second is that, as such, myth modifies the idea of fault, in that fault becomes part of a much larger total meaning, and total meaning itself involves distress, struggle, and victory. It follows from this a crucial point that the delineated myths will not correlate in any one-to-one sense to the symbolic. There is not, for Ricoeur, a myth of defilement or of sin or of guilt. At the same time, it seems clear that the symbol of guilt, in both its encapsulation of defilement and sin and its prompting of the turn to myth, has a greater causal role than its fellow symbols. This limiting claim and its consequences mean that Ricoeur will offer not a classification, but a dynamic of myths, of the beginning and end of evil, the drama of creation or myth of chaos, the myth of the fall, the tragic myth, and the myth of the exiled soul. The ambiguity of the symbol of guilt in relation to the claims for myth will mean that the articulated dynamic will turn out to require the insertion on the part of Ricoeur himself of a teleological interpretive moment. Now, Ricoeur's articulation and explication of his four myths can be readily organized in tabular format, and this is what I hope all of you have in front of you. It's called Figure 1, but it's actually the only figure. The initial move is to establish a textual basis for the myth. In reading the text, Ricoeur locates the representation or characterization of the relationship of the human to the divine. This relation has a particular import, which achieves full articulation in a figure. The consequence is a question that itself queries the initial postulated relation. The utility of the table, however, is that it underscores what Ricoeur really means by dynamics over against classification. His discussion is at least as interested, I would suggest, in reading across the categories as it is in reading down the myths. Now, our capacity to study the table both vertically and horizontally affords a way to see how Ricoeur is setting the table for the cycle of myths and its articulation of the innate complementarity between election and synthesis. The dynamics of myth is only fully captured when we are alert equally to, for example, the way that the drama of creation impresses upon its reader-believer the figure of the king as the embodiment of chaos and order, leaving us with the question of the enemy's location and the way in which it inflects and is inflected by the myth of the wicked god of Greek tragedy, with its sense that the location of enmity is in the gods themselves, and the central emergent figure is not the king, but the human person, for whom the sole prospect for independence is the recognition that the divine is in fact diabolical. Ricoeur's lengthy exegesis of the myths results in Symbolism's concluding chapter in an argument for what he calls the cycle of myths, by which he means that as each myth rises to speculation, it invites comparison and even prioritization. The gesture to thought that is innate to myth leads us to ask what orients our understanding to the myths. The question Ricoeur avers introduces what is of necessity an apologetic moment into the process. We must explicitly choose a central myth. Not to do so risks the possibility of comparison. Ricoeur also implies that it misleads to the degree that, by virtue of engaging in comparison, such a choice, however provisional, has de facto been made. It seems clear that for Ricoeur, the true dynamics of myth, their inflection of each other, implies the election of a preeminent or controlling myth. What would be the criteria for such a choice? Ricoeur answers this question exemplarily by stipulating the Adamic myth as preeminent. He gives 4 reasons, 2 that reflect criteria of election and 2 that reflect criteria of synthesis. The first theological reason is that the Christian believer is not in fact directly concerned with evil, but rather with sin as retrospective. This accords most closely with the account of the divine-human interaction in the Adamic myth. Echoes here of my earlier thought about proto-Christian should come to your mind if they haven't. The second philosophical, in a quasi-Pascalian mode, reason is that we must wager on what we discern in the myths. The third synthetic reason is that Adamic myth allows for the inclusion of all the other myths, whose essential claims to truth become affirmed in varying degrees in the Adamic myth. Well, the fourth, also synthetic reason is that the Adamic myth is most cognizant of the ways in which the myths claim to be true and demand appropriation. Placing the Adamic myth at the center most fully honors this and disallows any static relation among the other 3 myths. It is worth rehearsing in some detail Ricoeur's elaboration of his election of the Adamic myth. Ricoeur writes that the Adamic myth is anti-tragic, yet has tragic aspects. The serpent is already there and already evil, and Adam is accentuating an iniquity that is already there, yet at the same time put there. We see the tension of the finite with infinity and infinity without the infinite. We also discover guilt here in the human failure to realize wholeness. Finally, the Adamic myth is a spectacle that goes beyond thought. It makes visible the demonic side of experience. Through this, we can see a movement, as in tragedy, from anthropology to theology, where God is an ethical being and history is an arena of justice, in which the human experience has a penal character. We feel pity for Adam and Eve. We witness fear and trembling before God. Seen in this complementarity, Ricoeur contends the tragedy seen in the Adamic myth indexes human suffering. The myth is seen to argue that only the one who confesses to be the author of evil discovers evil's already there dimension on the one hand and God's incomprehensibility on the other. Through this, suffering comes to be seen as the tragic vision's alter ego. The wrath of God has survived the logos and the kerygma, and perdures in the fact of the suffering of those who are innocent. The Adamic myth also resonates with the theogonic myths. We see it in subsequent history, for example, in Heraclitus, as well as in 14th century German mystics and 19th century German idealism. Here the witness is chiefly to ontotheology, in which evil is an original element of being, resulting in tragedies of being that reference the categories of invincibility for the human and unthinkability for the divine. The wicked God is made part of the dialectic of being. Finally, the Adamic myth resonates with the exiled soul in the sense that we see through it that exile is the curse of the fall. On this, Orphic captivity and the exile of soul from body parallels the biblical idea of Exodus as an odyssey of the soul. The effects of this in the subsequent tradition are at least twofold. Adam as symbol of the human lessens as greater emphasis comes to be placed on his innocence, and exile becomes seductive, as in Plotinus and Pseudo-Dionysius. Here, too, the idea of the body as a symbol of defilement comes into play. Otherwise, the body would constitute an alibi for evil. In this respect, the body is not the origin of evil, but the place of the soul's captivity. In a coda to this section, Ricoeur remarks that the cycle is not entirely satisfactory. Hermeneutics, he says, has met its limit. We need at this point to turn to systematic philosophy to reach fully beyond personal appropriation to unify the myths. We can offer an initial formulation of what this would be in the assertion, the symbol gives rise to thought. This demarcates an interim, a necessary interim, between the mode of confession of sins and pure reflection on fallibility. This must be more than a juxtaposition of the symbol's gift of meaning and the philosopher's search for understanding. It is then no mere faith-seeking understanding. We discover both the powers and the limits of imaginative discourse at this moment. The symbols and resulting myths help philosophy with the problem of beginning. There is no Archimedean point. Philosophy, too, has presuppositions, and the symbols and myths perform the crucial role of allowing us to acknowledge this, indeed to engage it, and to claim a place from which to think. This indexes the crucial character of modernity, the dialectic of forgetfulness and restoration. We recognize that everything has been said, but said enigmatically. To begin again in thought, in a mode that combines criticism and appropriation, to interpret in order to hear, is to seek to achieve a second naivete, a post-critical equivalent of a pre-critical hierophany. We do this via a hermeneutical circle in which we understand to believe and believe to understand, no mere faith-seeking understanding. Crucial here is the recognition that demythologizing, the movement of criticism, is not demythicizing. We remain people of myth, but these mean for us not in their geographical or historical reference, but as myths. The limit of what we might term, quote, mere, end quote, cultural analysis is that our interest is in more than understanding the symbols of symbols, per someone like Eliade. That is comparison, and it has its value, but that is not, for Ricoeur, a philosophical value. Instead, we are interested in how the myths make claims vis-a-vis each other. The comparativist and the exegete live within the hermeneutical circle. The philosopher steps out both because she sees the myth as a wager and in turn recognizes the myth's command that we wager in response, that we follow the indication of the symbol toward thought. Now, if my rendition of Ricoeur's cycle of myths renders Ricoeur less than his reputedly Irenic self, that is intentional. There is a very strong claim here for the idea that all roads in the human sciences lead to philosophy, and in turn that all truly engaged cultural study must not only acknowledge but engage the truth claims of its object of inquiry. Put in the terms of the symbolism of evil, we might say that the study of myth must be at once elective and synthetic, and indeed that the one approach is implied by, indeed needs, the other. Roughly translated for a later day, we might say that Ricoeur is saying something like the following: no history of religions without theology. No theology without history of religions. Part 2, A Cycle of Myths of America, 1850 to 1867. A little bit of an interlude moment. There is in this description of Ricoeur's project perhaps an element of the archaic, at least terminologically. One way to capture this is to juxtapose the above discussion with that of Robert Orsi in his essay on lived religion, with its trenchant brief for the study of religion as extra-textual, that is to say, as consisting in locating sites of religious practice and then attending them to watch, to listen, and ultimately to report. To be sure, Orsi, and perhaps more emphatically his colleague David Hall, have no interest in discounting the place of thought in religious life, but they feel constrained to remind us that orthopraxy precedes orthodoxy, and it is a reminder that can seem particularly pertinent to Ricoeur's analysis in a book originally published over 50 years ago. That acknowledged, in what follows, I want to pursue the possible utility of Ricoeur's Architectonic via consideration of the remarkable incidents of the appearance of 4 American novels around the Civil War. Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter in 1850, Melville's Moby Dick or the Whale in 1851, Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin or Life Among the Lowly in 1852, and Louisa May Alcott's Little Women in 1867. Space precludes anything like the detailed treatment of the novels that Ricoeur affords the myths. You'll be relieved to hear that. My hope in what follows is to explore the powers and the limits of Ricoeur's idea of a cycle of myths by summarizing what I take to be the general warrants for this grouping of novels, and then examining how a reading of a particular scene from the Scarlet Letter can in fact be inflected by the other novels. In concluding, I shall argue that such an operation, aided by Ricoeur's idea of mythic cyclicality, really does afford address to the classic American problem of e pluribus unum. The crystallizing historical context for these 4 novels is, of course, the Civil War. The chief historical datum, I would say to this day, one could look, for instance, at Steven Spielberg's 2010 film Lincoln, if one wanted to think about that a little more, for American consideration of whether, in fact, from the many can come one. Hawthorne sees the Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne sets the Scarlet Letter in the early 1640s, just prior to the commencement of the Salem witch trials. He publishes the novel in 1850, just 10 years before the formal outbreak of the Civil War, but at a moment when anticipation about the prospect was both coalescing and intensifying. The juxtaposition is punctuated by his decision to open the novel, not in the New England town in the day Hester Prynne was the object of such scrutiny, but in a custom house of bureaucrats in late 1840s Salem. Moby Dick affords its reader a kind of micropedia entry on whaling definitions and perspectives from biblical text to the present. The reader then encounters the narrator Ishmael, whose fateful resolve to join a whaling fleet is driven by his sense that he is at present unfit for civil society, and that retreat to the sea will be of mutual benefit to him and to a social order that repels him. Uncle Tom's Cabin pitches the reader immediately into the transactions of slavery, with the negotiations between Mr. Shelby and Mr. Haley over the fate of Mr. and Mrs. Shelby's beloved servant, Eliza. Little Women opens with a Christmas Day celebration in which the domestically scaled neighborhood charity fostered among Meg, Joe, Amy, and Beth by their mother is ordered, purposeful, and above all peaceful in ways that underscore the absence of the man of the house and afford a counterpoint to the carnage he presumably encounters through his service as a minister in the war among the states. Given the specter of the war's presence, explicit in 3 of the novels, arguably implicit in Moby Dick, it is striking that all 4 novels offer geographical accounts of the identity of America, and through this of the relation of the one to the many. Over the course of the novels, America is charted respectively as municipality, as seaworthy ship, as territories north and south, and as domesticity. Each locale inflects the relation of the one and the many. In The Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne suggests that America's identity is captured in the polity of one of its oldest municipalities. The relation of the one and the many is both utterly determinative and ironized. It is determinative in the power of its social convention to, deploying one of Ricoeur's symbols, defile one of its members in the ascription to Hester Prynne of the Scarlet Letter. The ironization is double. It is Hester Prynne herself who sews the letter that she wears, and the letter she knits is itself an object of beauty and a witness to her emergent role as seamstress for the community. The Scarlet Letter links the community by allighting the fabric of shame with the fabric of community. In Moby Dick, the whaling industry, an essential component of American commerce, literally becomes, on and below the deck of the Pequod, the stage for an extended exploration of how Ahab's megalomania can direct the movement of the ship and marshal the cooperative will of its crew. Here the relationship of the one and the many is mediated less by the objective correlate of fabric than by the stipulation of a community that assembles around the impulse to go to sea. Ahab's great skill is his capacity to tap into the common wanderlust, to make his crew conform in toto, even as individuals as high-ranking as Starbuck, first seemingly and then increasingly doubt the ship's course as charted by him. In Uncle Tom's Cabin, Stowe invokes and then subverts the history of North and South. While Tom and Eliza's journeys proceed in opposite directions, and the ever deeper South Tom comes to inhabit indexes increasingly harsh cruelty in contradistinction to Eliza Harris's Canada of Possibility, Stowe is ever more explicit that the real territorial division is of the right and the wrong-minded, which is to say that Stowe reminds us, for example, that Simon Legree, by far the most vicious slave owner in the book, comes from Vermont, and it is not the one but the many who bear the taint of America's original sin. In Little Women, the domestic arena is valorized. America is its homes, and the domestic economy is run by and in turn fosters those who become little women, who recognize that the project of salvation is local and has to do with the fostering acts of goodness. By the end of the book, when the three surviving March girls have each married and established their own domestic spheres, the explicitly gendered category expands to include anyone who joins in the process of inventories and setting a house in order. Alcott's narrative presents a story of incremental growth in which the survival of the nation depends upon the passing down of these commitments. We see in the domestication of Joe and the death of Beth the costs of to the one of the deeds of the many. Acquiescence in the program is formative. How might we see these novels as engaging in the sort of inflection that Ricoeur adopts for the cycle of myths? To pursue this question, I will turn our attention first to Chapter 5 of Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, Hester at Her Needle. As noted above, Hester's needlework is central to the novel. In this characteristically short chapter, Hawthorne does not so much move the action forward as offer us an ongoing contrapuntal meditation on the relationship of the community's idea of sin and Hester's needlework. Recall that this is the moment in the narrative in which Hester Prynne is released from prison into the community, when, in the narrator's words, quote, "she was made the common infamy at which all mankind was summoned to point its finger." Hester is figured explicitly as the figure, the body, the reality of sin. The narrative proceeds to relate the process by which, however lonely, Hester experiences not risk of want, precisely because the scarlet letter she wears is, quote, "a specimen of her delicate and imaginative skill." Quickly employed to produce garments suitable for public ceremonies, funerals, and baby linens, but never wedding gowns, it is the case, the reader is informed that, quote, "by degrees, not very slowly, her handiwork became what would now be termed the fashion." Yet the process serves not to assimilation, but to further differentiation, and precisely in terms of Hester's sinfulness. The refusal to employ her for wedding dress, quote, "indicated the ever-relentless vigor with which society frowned upon her sin." These discriminations of the one from the many have as their immediate counterpart the important discovery that Hester herself participates in the distinction of her selfhood from that of the community. The convention of coarse dress with an accompanying ornament that is the wellspring of her own fantastic ingenuity finds its opposite in Hester's dressing of her daughter, Pearl. In the first major sign of Pearl's uninhibited nature, Hester sews clothes at her little daughter's behest that allow Pearl to dress against convention, that is to say, colorfully and distinctively, nothing drab, everything ornamented. We then learn that this bespeaks Hester's own deep ambiguity about her gift. Hester rejects any pleasure in the needle as sin. To counteract any impulse to embrace pleasure, Hester devotes as much of her sewing as possible to charity work. Here the narrator sees the power of the many, of social coercion, as an audit on Hester's internal self. And I quote, "This morbid meddling of conscience with an immaterial matter betokened, it is to be feared, no genuine steadfast penitence, but something doubtful, something that might be deeply wrong beneath." This, the narrator concludes, describes nothing less than Hester's part to perform in the world. She had schooled herself long and well in her curse. At this point, the reader is reminded that Hester's internal counsel reflects a polity that cunningly contrives the widest diffusion of her shame, so that it feels as though not just the social world, but all of nature knew it. The effect of this, described by Hawthorne as a continually fresh branding of the letter in her soul, nonetheless prompts a question. Had Hester sinned alone? If the link of one and many is so determinative and inexplicable, can the connection simply move in one direction? Returning to Hester's inner self, her oneness, we learn that the ubiquity of the letter on her heart and in her soul has served to forge in her over time a new sense, quote, a sympathetic knowledge of the hidden sin in other hearts, end quote. The recognitions the Scarlet Letter prompts are as inexorable as they are painful and confusing. It can be visceral. The Scarlet Letter itself throbs when Hester passes one of the publicly hallowed righteous people in the community, suggesting to Hester a disjunction of appearance and reality. More often it is a passing glance, a blush of recognition, or a fixation on the letter. Hawthorne concludes, the vulgar, who in those dreary old times were always contributing a grotesque horror to what interested their imaginations, had a story about the Scarlet Letter which we might readily work up into a terrific legend. They averred that the symbol was not mere scarlet cloth, tinged in an earthy dye pot, but was red hot with infernal fire, and could be seen glowing all alight whenever Hester Prynne walked abroad in the nighttime. And we must needs say, it seared Hester's bosom so deeply that perhaps there was more truth in the rumor than our modern incredulity may be inclined to admit. In this concluding reflection to the chapter, the many and the one, sin and needlework, each unwittingly but decisively imbricate the other. The vulgar many create a terrific legend of the one that is both wildly implausible, yet remarkably close to the truth. There is an innate serendipity in the Scarlet Letter between needlework and sin. Each is at once individual and social, and each needs the other. If one were to understand Hawthorne's rendition of the one and the many in America in the way that Ricoeur understands Adamic myth, as the controlling understanding, how might one do that while also allowing the renditions of his fellow practitioners to inflect the Scarlet Letter? Turning first to Moby Dick, we are struck by the tension between first and third person narration. Part of the riddle of the Scarlet Letter is that even granting the reliability of its narrator, we can know Hester Prynne's mind in the way that we are not sure that we can know Hester Prynne's mind in the way that we would wish to know it. In terms of the one and the many, however, the chief distinction from the Scarlet Letter is the way that Melville underscores from the outset in the relationship between Ishmael and Queequeg that the community of the many is in fact plural, not only in hidden but in very open ways. The move from the metropolis to the ocean is in part a liberation from hiding, but in Moby Dick it is always the case that characterization is itself the cataloging, the enumeration of difference. Precisely this indexes Ahab's suasive power, the capacity to unite such disparate histories, sensibilities, and dispositions to a single task. For Melville, the task proves ruinous, fatal to scores of the many. The destruction of the Pequot is in a very real sense the leveling of the intrinsic differentiation that describes humanity. Whereas Hester Prynne's Scarlet Letter taught her the oneness of the many in sinfulness, Ahab's quest for the whale renders plurality one in death. As noted above, Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin is, like the Scarlet Letter, animated by a focus on sin, in this case the sin of slavery rather than the sin of adultery. And the geographical elaboration of this is the opposite of Hawthorne's. Stowe's America is the most writ large America of any of these novels, the most capacious in its sense of the spaces of the nation. And while Stowe's religious psychology is decidedly not related to the geography of North and South, it is emphatically binary. There is white Christianity and there is black Christianity. and the failure that engenders and sustains the slave trade is that Protestant white Christians are insufficiently heartfelt in their adoption of the teachings of Jesus, in contradistinction to black Christians. Here the inflection has to do chiefly with the capacity of the imagination. Whereas in the Scarlet Letter, all souls are shrouded in secrecy and share a common humanity of sinfulness, in Uncle Tom's Cabin, souls occupy places on a spectrum of good and evil-heartedness that is fully manifest to the reader, if not to the characters themselves. I should slightly amend that. Stowe's narrator interposes at various points where she's clearly concerned about whether the reader has fully grasped good-heartedness and bad-heartedness. But as a general point, it is very different, I think. In terms of the one and the many, the problem is a binary problem. The making of the one from the many is a matter of soft abolitionists searching their hearts and honoring the better angels of their natures. Stowe did not, however, share Lincoln's innate faith that all humans had such better angels. Like Hawthorne, her narrative depicts an uglier dimension to humanity that appears ineluctable. The problem of the one is, for Stowe, a problem of overcoming both the failings of the good and the extremities of evil. Alcott's Little Women differs from Moby Dick and Uncle Tom's Cabin in that its compass is actually smaller even than that of the Scarlet Letter. The domestic sphere is the place where the necessary lessons for overcoming innate selfishness are well taught and best learned. Here the one can become the many. Generosity learned in childhood can in turn generate children who themselves will learn the lessons of the project of goodness as the road to salvation. In the context of this inflection, it is hardly amiss to note that it is the sole title in the plural. At the same time, we underestimate the diminutive at our peril. Alcott's comparatively modest compass carries with it arguably the least darkness with regard to the problem of the many. This is accomplished, however, with a sensibility that is, in at least a formal sense, nothing short of ruthless. Beth's death, heavily foreshadowed and unmistakably a source of grief and sadness, it is at least implicitly commensurate with the project of becoming and extending the project of Little Women. The many are the ones in this world by virtue of sensibility. It is only a slight stretch to say that one gets it or one does not. In this respect, the proto-feminist Jo's ultimate conformity indexes a great deal. How then is a reading of the Scarlet Letter meaningfully inflected by these readings of its three companion novels? One cannot return to Hawthorne's text from Alcott's without thinking harder about the implied yet incomplete domesticity of Hester's needlework. This brings into relief the discontinuity between her daughter Pearl, whose protean resistance to the world's censure does not carry with it any clear complementary sense of maternal emulation. And one cannot return to Hawthorne's text from Stowe's without thinking harder about the yoking of Hester's needlework with sinfulness, where Hawthorne leaves us with a somewhat ambiguous, or at least exiguous, sense of Hester's moral relation to herself. Stowe gives no quarter in moral judgment and sees ambiguity as a signal of imminent treachery. We may resist the implications, but we cannot avoid the question. And one cannot return to Hawthorne's text from Melville's without noticing the presumptive common religio-moral sensibility and asking about its exact source. Where is the Ahab who controls this community? And where are its real diversities? Some preliminary conclusions. The point of Ricoeur's mythic cycle was to delineate the ways in which the symbols of fallibility give rise to narratives of fault. My argument has not been that there is a straightforward thematic unity between Ricoeur's treatment of evil and the American novels. It has rather been to claim that there is a potential analytic utility for the study of culture. I am tempted, for obvious reasons, to say for the study of religion and literature, in the application of the mythic cycle to the American novel of the Civil War period. That Ricoeur's transformation of the problem of evil into the question of the human-divine relation has as its counterpart in the novels the question of the one and the many, or perhaps the better, the question of the one to the many and of the many to the one. I've tried to suggest that the mode of inflection that is central to Ricoeur's model applies straightforwardly to the novels. One can, via a particular thematic context, highlight or privilege one over the others, and in turn, read the privileged fictional work in ways that bring to bear the alternative treatments. To be clear, inflection is not comparison per se, but actually thinking differently about the central text. The claim then is not so much that novels interpret each other, but that criticism can initiate cycles of inflection in which a central text retains its individuality, yet reads differently because related texts are read and remembered in its rereading. The importance of this for Ricoeur is that a transformation occurs in our understanding of cultural heritage. In brief, everything matters, all irony intended. Bracketing off one text is not just no longer possible, it is unacceptable. The moral dimension of the complementarity of election and inflection is the sense that one must choose, but that in choosing one must also inflect. Ricoeur's focus on Western materials is both a limiting factor and essential to his point. Works such as, for example, The Philosophy of Religion, done in a properly comparative way, is exactly what he thought he was doing. Again, all ironies intended. In this sense, the cultural work Ricoeur understood in the Symbolism of Evil is at once vexingly dated and, I would suggest, promisingly current. Thank you.
So let's begin first with questions for Professor Rosengarten, and then we'll branch out in conversation. You can stay there. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for the fascinating paper. I mean, I was struck by the creativity in choosing these texts. And at the beginning, at the outset, thank you. At the outset, you spoke about, you mentioned, you brought up, you posed the question, do we have a mandate for sort of adopting this way of approaching text in the American context? Mm-hmm. And I find it fascinating that it took the scene of the Scarlet Letter as the central controlling myth and showed how they could be reflected by the other text. But I want to hear more about the mandate. And so I'm wondering if you could say more about why that
Just very fair question. Very fair question. The honest answer is utility. The honest answer is that I pull the punch a bit in the sense that I don't valorize one in the paper, right? I don't do what Ricoeur does. And I don't because I have misgivings about what Ricoeur does in that regard. I don't want to be understood to be proto-Christian in the way that he is. So that's the honest, direct answer, but it's absolutely characteristically right. So thank you. So let me try to say a little more to do a little bit more with that than just the very practical side of it. So one of the things that I think is vexing about this is the degree to which cultural criticism needs to recognize its incipient normativity in the choice of what it does, right? And I guess that if I were going to make the argument for choosing Hawthorne in that respect, and I don't do it in the paper, I would make it on two grounds. One is that it's first, and that the other books are clearly aware of it in different ways. And I don't go into that here, but Melville's engagement with Hawthorne is quite well known. Stowe clearly had read the book, so had Alcott, and so there's a historical claim of precedence there, which I think is not unlike Ricoeur's claim, although it doesn't get us to what you're asking about, which is the valorization, right? The second thing I would say is that I think that the other three books are sufficiently exceptional in the scenarios of the one and the many that they name that I'm at a loss to be able to do the same form of inflection with them. That is to say, if I valorize Moby Dick, I'm not as confident I can make Hawthorne inflected. Now, that's a problem that I actually haven't thought through completely, but it's a problem of the ways in which these texts are not commensurate, right? So there's a way in which, in other words, Hawthorne's decision to work in miniature and Melville's decision to work epically, it seems to me, complicate this claim, and I'm just not as prepared as I should be to sort all that out, in effect. But that's the other thing I would say, is that there's an odd way, on my take at least, that Hawthorne is most amenable to this inflection, that they're thinking back to him, and that gives it priority. The problem with that, I think, but help me with this, because I'm really not thought through on it. The problem with that is that Hawthorne becomes a default setting for instrumental rather than philosophical reasons, it seems to me, which is to say he just came first, right? And I'm nervous about that. I'm nervous about the prioritization of that, both just as a historical problem. I don't think Ricoeur would necessarily like that. Not that I'm wedded to Ricoeur, I have my problems, but I'm also aware that if one is going to choose responsibly, one isn't going to be limited by that. So it's an uneasy appropriation, and you're absolutely right to bring it up. So the degree to which this is the second part, to put it differently, is more about inflection than election is spot on, and it's an issue. Anyway, I don't know if that...
No, it's fascinating. Thank you. I mean, I'm just instructed in terms of how you lay out the relationships between the texts, and I find the idea of historical precedent to be compelling. Mm-hmm. And I too have reservations about, as you put it, the proto-Christian side of Ricoeur's method when it comes to reading myth. The interesting thing is that in the choice of the Scarlet Letter, you have this narrative, or this description of what looks like a kind of genetic account of sin, right? Where all who have sinned in Adam. And the big question is how that works out. And we know that there is very interesting discussions in the tradition about the way in which one is present in Adam, or Adam is present in the individual, such that one could sin in Adam, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have, there's a deep resonance between, let's say, the idea that all are sin in Adam, and the kind of unity that comes out of it.
If I could just say one more thing about that, that's very helpful. I can explain my dis-ease with this better in the following way. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention, when the convention closed and all its members came out, a very old Benjamin Franklin appeared, and someone said to him, "Mr. Franklin, what government have you given us?" And his answer was, "A republic if you can keep it." And when I yoke that with the fact, with the continual, particularly in our contemporary discourse, elision of the founding fathers' religion with Christianity, when they were in fact deists, to a very large degree, I'm very worried about the Hawthorne appropriation valorizing the Adamic myth into the American tradition in ways that are problematic. So it's that kind of thing that I'm worried about, and thinking that through well is something I haven't been able to do. But that's the kind of worry I have.
Other questions for Professor Rosengarten? I feel like this is
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, good, yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, can I ask a question? Do you think that Ricoeur valorizes the Adamic myth? I know that sounds stupid because it seems obvious, but do you think there was an academic reason for doing that, simply because he was in a Christian tradition, rather than because he really thought that Adamic myth had value greater than the others? I mean, so if you said he didn't necessarily valorize it, maybe you could say you just chose the Scarlet Letter because it has Adamic valorization. Do you know what I mean?
Right,
if you valorize it, it doesn't mean that actually you value it.
Right.
It could just be that that's what works.
Right.
Because it's the dominant in the culture, or you just choose it as a dominant point of view.
Yes. Short answer. Long answer would be twofold. One is, I think there's a deep tension in Ricoeur between election and inflection that can be understood to be on there is a charitable and a suspicious reading of that. And the charitable reading is that the Adamic myth is chosen for the reasons he gives, which is that it's the most deeply efficient myth. We're talking about all of them. And the uncharitable one is the suspicion that between every line of the text, is his Protestant sensibility that's driving this, and that is reflected in things, and I was instructed by your paper on this, like, for example, his complete inattention to medieval Christianity, for example, or medieval religiosity, where, your point about the absence of the body is just so manifest that he could not grapple with it, but he does the big leap, right, from the ancient world to modernity, and even in time and narrative, his resources are august, and that's about as far into the early period as Ricoeur will go. So I think there are two ways to read it, and partly from teaching this book the last couple of years, as a few of the poor souls in the audience I've become more and more persuaded by the suspicious reading, and the degree to which it's unavoidably there. Even as I do think there's real potential in the more proactive reading, if it's appropriately chastened or whatever. I don't know what the right word would be. Something like that.
But it's also interesting if I compare that text to a text I teach, which is Carolyn Franks Davis of Evidential Force of Religious Experience, where it's just a rehashing of Swinburne's position. And she looks at the conflicts between religion, and of course the one that comes out on top is Christianity. It has, these unramified core beliefs that are the same in all religions. So it's partly how philosophy of religion has actually done comparative literature, comparative religions, that it will come up with your own position. Right. You're not going to come up with another position.
Yes. Yeah, I want to be very careful here. I don't want to suggest that I think that the commitment to the election of a predominant myth should not or cannot be religious. I worry about the degree to which Ricoeur's argument for his election is not as candid as it should be about what's driving it. That's the thing. So just to be very clear here, I don't want to discount religious impulses and criticism at all. That's fine. But the degree to which that's clear here is, I think, open to question. Another reason that I worry about this is it even reverberates in a work like Oneself is Another, where he says, okay, here's everything I did for the Gifford lectures except the two on biblical exegesis, because I know this to be a purely philosophical argument. Well, come on. It seems to me that's problematic at some level in both directions, right? On the one hand, why is it axiomatically the case that a religious claim would somehow imbue cultural criticism or claims with less validity? I think that's problematic. On the other hand, it also suggests that the project is animated in ways that are unstated, which is precisely the worry one has with symbolism of evil. So it's a worry. Again, I can't say that I'm totally in one camp or the other, but it's for me a wobbling pivot.
So, do you mind, because we've already begun to kind of branch out and relate the two papers, I just want to take a moment and kind of think about two themes that seem to arise for both of them. One, not fully stated, but I think really implicit in both of them, which is kind of the burden and the pleasure of inheritance. I think that's already clear in your thematizing election and inflection, but I thought Pamela was also clear in your reading in the sense that what it meant to go back to the Antigone and Adam myths at those moments, and what it meant to actually find the space of developing these capabilities in imagining the space after that myth, and why those myths have to be the site of imagining that capability, but also how we might be able to negotiate with them in your theme of election and inflection. So I guess I was hoping that you could both reflect a little bit about how you think about the role of inheritance in Ricoeur, but also in the sort of the legacy that he leaves us. I guess the other theme that I thought came out, particularly in the conversation, is the way in which the Adamic myth reverberates in your centralizing of the Scarlet Letter. And I guess the irony of that is, of course, that you too did not really emphasize gender in your treatment of Hester Prynne. And I guess I wonder if that isn't an opportunity, if Pamela's paper is an opportunity for you to kind of reflect on what she has to say about the fact that Ricoeur ignores that and the position that you place the Scarlet Letter in the kind of American context. So maybe you want to start with that and we can develop from there.
Sure. Yeah. No, thank you. That's great.
That's a good topic, though.
So gender in the Scarlet Letter. I had hoped that I was beginning to get at that with the emphasis on needlework. But certainly in lieu of Pamela's paper and your question, I'm prompted to think that my hope was at best partially realized. I think that Hester's gender is a problem, and a complicated problem, in the sense that Hawthorne's, to go to Pamela's paper, Hawthorne's attention to fleshiness is so glancing in the text that we're told of Hester's beauty, and we get occasional brief indexes of it, but her fleshiness is not really something that's there so much. On the other hand, her sin is, especially in contrast to Dimsdale, so manifestly a gendered sin that I think the text has this tension in terms of gender figuration between not making Hester corporeal and making Hester's identifying corporeality, namely the letter, distinctively feminine. So I think something like that would be the place where I would tend to go with it. But
can I push slightly further?
Push away. This is great.
I mean, because when you, by using myth as the context in which you're thinking about these four novels, and then placing the Scarlet Letter at the center of that, you're also in some sense asking us to think about what it would mean for Hester Prynne to serve as a kind of Adamic site, right? So then you have that figure standing in that relationship.
That's helpful.
How does that function mythically?
Yeah, no, that's good. It's a reversal, isn't it? No, that's very helpful. That's better than I can say it. Yeah, I would agree with that.
What effect do you think that has, I guess I'm curious, if you're going to think about it mythically?
Well, I think in terms of the one and the many, it makes a woman the one who can encompass the many in a way that is not otherwise the case, so that e pluribus unum organizes itself around the figure of the feminine. And that's certainly a recurrent problem in the American context. So I think that's a dimension of it for sure. Let's see. I mean, it's funny because, and this is probably a way in which I'm a little too incipiently recurring. As you're asking me about this, I keep thinking about Dimsdale, which is in certain ways not what you want me to do, of course. But Hester is so vastly superior to Dimsdale in depth of feeling, in alertness to the world, in having both self-possession and the capacity to see what's going on around her, that he's the kind of antitype. So I don't think he's exactly the serpent. I think Chillingworth is that. But there's an odd way in which he's certainly not Adam to her Eve or Eve to her Adam. He's some diminished, partial truncated being. I don't know.
No, that's fine.
Something. Well, it's a good prompt. I have to think more about that.
I guess I want to ask you a question too, because it seems to me this needlework that she's doing it's an act that might put her outside of the male language or social ordering. Mm-hmm. So you could say
that's good.
It's the area of objection that she's defiled. The stain is the red letter representing, it's the symbol. Something that's impure, materially and morally. So you've got the double intentionality there of defilement. But equally, so the Christeva and Ricoeur thing, she seems to be the site of communication between what's going to be objected or expelled and the social symbolic order, which she really isn't a part of, but she can see inside of it. So she's, but there's something too about how Christeva tries to see the eruption of the feminine in the social symbolic order. I mean, I know this isn't mature. I don't know. Is there a maternal sense to this needlework as well? I mean, is that the mother's activity with the daughter?
Sure. Well, the activity with the daughter is problematic because Pearl is such an independent agent, unruly.
So, but she might be, though, also equally disrupted over the patriarchal order or not. I don't know. I mean, there's a weirdness about what he must think sin is here. I mean, is there a suggestion that the daughter is going to carry on sin? Or what is the sin? I mean, we know it's the...
Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, part of the problem with the Scarlet Letter is that sin is largely retrospective, right? It's in the past. And what we're dealing with is the effect of the sin. So when you say, what is the sin is the condition in which
She finds herself.
this person,
Yeah.
well, in which she finds herself, is the best way to put it, because one of the debates is, what the heck has she done? And I tried to suggest this earlier, who has decided this exactly and how, right? So that's part of it. But there's also the problem, and this is, I hadn't thought about this, but this is prompted by your comments. I mean, there isn't an apple, but there is a letter, right?
Yeah.
And the letter is something that she creates. So there's a way in which Hester is almost both Eve and the serpent, weirdly enough. She's both creating the corporal witness to the fault, and in that it becomes transformative, because it's both the way she sees the sin in everybody else and the way in which she becomes the fabric of the community, literally and figuratively. So if the Adamic myth is reversed both in terms of privileging the woman over the man, it may also be reversed in terms of the symbolization of the fault and its effects on the community in some way. That whereas the eating of the apple leads to their banishment, the stitching of the letter actually creates the community.
That's so beautiful, because there's this wonderful way in which your desire to read this sort of sequel to the Eve story, to think about the rehabilitation of capabilities, actually works out perfectly if you think about the Scarlet Letter as a rewriting of the Adamic myth.
We were on the phone for days.
But then I think that there's
Here we go.
the argument that you're citing from Ricoeur, that in some sense literature needs philosophy to sort of form its unifying position. It really gets called into question by the sort of the capacity of what Hawthorne is able to do as a kind of literary answering back to myth, rather than merely a sort of like interpretation and compiling, you know?
Right. Absolutely. There's no question that there's a danger in the Ricoeurian model of diminishing the role of cultural criticism vis-a-vis philosophy. No doubt about that. Old problem, as you know.
But also the interpretive power of others.
Yes, right. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Which goes to the burden of pleasure, right? Your burden of pleasure question, of inheritance. Yeah.
But it's also the problem for women with philosophy. If philosophers just continually select only Antigone or only Eve or only the seductive woman, there are plenty of other gendered figures philosophers could use, but they don't.
Well, I thought there were a couple of respects in which you were gentle on that point with Ricoeur, because I was trying to think, I have to go through it, but unless I'm very much mistaken, every implication of Antigone in Symbolism of Evil is accompanied by a more lengthy implication of Oedipus. And we never get Creon, which it seems to me would be the more natural affiliation, which would valorize Antigone to a greater degree. So I think we're nice to him on that score.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wasn't very critical of Ricoeur in this paper, but I think it's a problem with all of Western philosophy. So I wasn't trying to just blame Ricoeur, because I think that is a huge problem when you try to find gender in philosophical texts. That it's in asides and stories and myths, and it's usually pejorative figures of women, if there are women.
In terms of the, I'm sorry, did I? In terms of the burden of pleasure thing, I don't know if other people would agree with this, but I would want to argue that the parallel in our papers is that your worry about the feminine is my worry about Judaism at some level. That I think there's the real meaning of proto-Christian is supersessionism, right? Really.
Yeah.
So that the worry here that I have is that if election involves that kind of movement, then I think inflection is impossible, right? I don't think inflection, and I do not think that is Ricoeur's theoretical intent. I think both the care of his reading in ancient sources and in scholarship, I think he's trying very hard to avoid that, but in spite of himself, he creates that specter. So just as you're worried about the religion of the feminism, I'm worried, I'm taught partly by your work on Derrida in this, I'm worried about the religion of Judaism, and I think those are parallels.
But you see, this again is whether you think of Ricoeur or others looking at the sexual difference. If you don't have a different way of looking at gender, it's quickly, you blame the other then, don't you? These binaries. So then you're actually biased against men or biased against Judaism. If you emphasize your identity over against the other, and that seems to be one of the problems with certain sort of feminist debates, where they're getting essentialism. So if you're going to emphasize, sexual differences in Ricoeur, what about, ethnocentrism or racism and all that? And yeah. So I think trying to look at bias is really hard because it's just so easy. I mean, Ricoeur's trying to be open-minded and look at different myths, but he falls into a bias.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like, how do you get out of your own racism, or how do you get out of your own skin?
Well, I mean, the way Professor Hammerschlag put it, the burden and inheritance, puts me in mind of our colleague Curtis Evans's book on the burden of black religion, where I think the term is under-theorized, but nonetheless theorized, where he talks about, the historical oddity of pro and anti-slavery people citing exactly the same scriptural text in support of their position.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that something like that alertness to cultural signification and claim is what the potential of the inflection can be. So that burden and inheritance come into some close proximity, right? That we're both at one and the same time celebrating something that isn't, I mean, this is very colloquially put, but that's the way my mind works under duress, the embarrassment of riches, and on the other hand, an incredibly difficult kind of process of implication, and how one manages those things together. I mean, I think it's why the work of cultural criticism is actually so important, because finding the ways to do that well is really tough. And in that sense, Ricoeur is wonderful because he cares about that, right?
Yeah.
But it's also unnerving as hell, because when you look at it in retrospect, you see that somebody that smart and well-read could do things, and you think, yikes! I do not want to do this, right? So it's that kind of weird dynamic of, wow, this is really great, but it's also really unnerving.
I want to take an opportunity to allow some of the questions in the audience. Sir, please.
Thanks so much. Professor Rosengarten, I'm so interested in this issue in the early Ricoeur of the limits of hermeneutics. And the point at which I think you said where the phenomenological philosopher needs to take the step that the exegete can't, step outside of the partial symbolic register and say something integrative or synthetic. Do you think this can square with the later Ricoeur, or is he simply changing his mind in the rule of metaphor on where he articulates the poetic, the descriptive quality rather than merely celebratory or ornamental quality of poetics? In other words, if there's something being articulated in the partial, in the very particular poetic mood, in say the myths, the novels you're describing, what's at stake, or what's the liability then of the philosophical integration? So I guess the first part of the question is, do you think that squares, or is the tension not one that Ricoeur resolves when he changes his mind? And then the second part of the question would be, in your opinion, and in the work that you're doing, I heard the tension in your presentation when you talked about the incommensurability of the novels you selected. But is there still a work of integrative, if you like, philosophical attention to what's gained from the combination of things?
Yeah, thank you for that. A couple of thoughts. I'm not sure I can do full justice to that, but let me try. I mean, I'm instructed by people like Professor Coyne and Professor Tracy that there is in Ricoeur's work a constant tension around, especially I mentioned, I remember this morning, around what to do with Hegel. And that a way to think about it is that for Ricoeur, if you reject Hegel, you don't go forward to Heidegger, you go back to Kant.
Yeah.
And so I think the problem, and that's, I have to footnote Professor Point, because that basically is a learning from him. And it seems to me that's right. And that it's arguably constant throughout his work. That Ricoeur is constantly dealing with, on the one hand, the deep attraction of Hegelian's dialectic sensibility and its power, and his worry about the summative synthetic moment. And that he's both compelled by it and, in some sense, repelled by it, although that's probably strong. So, when you talk about the philosophical or synthetic moment, I think for Ricoeur, there's this constant search for doing so in a way that doesn't require him to articulate a final Hegelian synthesis. And that's the dynamic that's in play. And I think philosophy as well as cultural criticism is held prey to that for him. And it's both the power and the limit of it, you know. So the power of it is that he's incipiently and deeply and virtually dialectical. And he wants to be like the Hegel of the lecture on fine arts as well as the phenomenological spirit. But when he comes to the moment of offering the four architectonics of culture, he pulls back. So I think that's what's at play there. So I think it's incipient to Ricoeur.
I think we have time for one last question. You had a question.
Professor Rosengarten, it's really great to have your bringing of the psychoanalysis into American culture. And it seems that there are very interesting ways in which this inflects on how we think about canon. Both for what might be deemed as a classic, but also getting back to this point of burden, the dual nature of burden, right? The burden of accountability, in which we have to continue to keep the birth of the nation within something that we cannot bracket out birth of the nation. While we also have this burden of responsibility to continue to think about the text that has been obscured throughout the past canon. And so since you are a premier figure of religion literature, I think I was wondering if you could just maybe say a little more about canon with regards to, and particularly where do we draw those lines? I mean, we still have, at least in Tracy's work, we still have the classic, which doesn't necessarily need to be the classic text, but a text that continues to resound. We're reading Moby Dick. There's probably a lot of other meanings or not.
The first, I can do no better initially than to echo Professor Anderson and say that the first obligation is not to dilate on just Antigone or just or other figures, and it really is to bring as many things into play as possible. And I mean, part of the reason to get Alcott and Stone to play is they're not canonical in the same way that Hoffman and Melville are. And I debated a lot about whether I could valorize one of them, and I couldn't make it work, but I mean, that's an effort there. I think the other thing, though, and this is one of the things I really appreciate about your work going towards Deleuze and people like that, is to suggest the unacknowledged blind spots in the context of the thinkers we use, right? That, and this is a place where I think, for example, someone like Derrida in the depth of literature is really good, because what you see there is that the chamber of reverberation is limitless in some way, and that becomes an animating principle for what you say. So that if I'm understanding this correctly, vis-a-vis my other colleague in the field's work, the principle of interpretation is always that the reverberation, or if you want to say inflection, is in some sense limitless, right? And that's a responsibility. So something like that, I think, has to be in play in this. But but that's also a challenge, because the more you acknowledge it, the more difficult. I mean, you get back to the recurring problem, how you choose that, right? and I mean, the broader the tapestry, the tougher it is to enact. Back to Professor Point's question.
Well, that seems like a great point to end with. Please join me in thanking both of our speakers and Professor Rosengarten for organizing the whole conference.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.